Hi, I'm Jan Gerber. In this episode of our Mental Health Awareness podcast series, I'll be talking to Beverley Knight, a well-known and decorated singer, and her husband James O'Keefe. Both Beverley and James have been through interesting, sometimes difficult, sometimes very, very difficult phases in their lives, from childhoods into their forming years at school, into their adult lives. And I'll be looking forward for them to share their stories. So I'm sitting here with the wonderful Beverley Knight and her wonderful husband, James O'Keefe. Why don't you briefly introduce yourself?
Well, I'm Beverley Knight. I am a singer, writer, and latterly I'm an actress now. So I do a few things. Yeah, been doing it a while. 25 years.
25 years, a quarter of a century, as you just said.
25 years, quarter of a century. It's a long time to be doing something, but I love it, so that's good.
Brilliant. Do what you love to do.
Absolutely.
James.
And yeah, as you said, I'm James O'Keefe, and I'm currently a property developer and I suppose an entrepreneur as well, doing kind of a few different business activities and just trying to have some fun along the way as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Lots of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, welcome to this podcast and thank you so much for agreeing.
That's a pleasure.
Yeah.
Our mission is to spread mental health awareness, and we've talked previous to this recording a bit about your story. Mm-hmm. And maybe let's start where everything starts with childhood. Mm-hmm. Both of you had your own struggles in your childhoods. You had complex parents and complex relationships with your parents, with your fathers. Mm. I would say ladies first. Do you want to talk a bit?
I had, for the most part, my childhood was a happy one. The thing that made it complicated was I was born and raised in Britain. My parents were born and raised in Jamaica, in the West Indies. They met, married in Britain, had us kids. So my mum pretty quickly, I would say, adapted and assimilated into the British way of life. It was something they were used to because, Britain used to own Jamaica as a colony, so they were used to how Brits did things. Brits were not used to them at all. So my dad struggled. He came to Britain. He wasn't treated well at all. I don't think there were any Jamaicans who were treated well in the beginning, and then some,
And it was the no, in the pubs at the time, because my family are
Irish.
My dad's side are Irish
immigrants.
So there's a kind of synergy there with the no
dogs, no blacks,
no Irish. There were signs in the pubs.
Signs.
Yeah, that's right.
When they were looking for places to live, no dogs, no blacks, no Irish, and so you'd be like, okay then, well that's me then, And so my mum, probably being a woman, didn't suffer that confrontational prejudice that my dad got. My dad got the worst of it and didn't go into detail talking about it. So when I say we, my older sister, my younger brother, we grew up as part and parcel of Britain, but we knew we were a very visible minority. So sometimes we went through racist episodes, kind of implicit racism as opposed to too much confrontational racism. That only happened on one occasion where it did happen, which was horrible, was a bunch of skinheads surrounded me on my bike. I was very young, about 6, and was like, we want your bike, your lot shouldn't be here. And I was like, you can't have my bike, it's my bike. Get up, go back. Oh yeah,
that's my girl.
I wasn't having it. I was 6 and I was not having it. You lot should get out, go back to your own country. I was born here. And then they tried to take my bike off me and I pedaled home, and so those kind of things happened. But as a child, I felt as though I felt this duality of my existence. I was British on the one hand, and I had Jamaican heritage on the other, and there was this duality. And I think my dad was uncomfortable with that. He saw these British children growing up in front of him, and whilst he was happy for us to be growing up and being raised, and keyword for my dad was educated in Britain, he really struggled with our British sense of feeling as though we had the freedom to speak freely. West Indian children weren't supposed to speak freely. That's, quite old-fashioned. And out of the three of us, I was easily the mouthiest. If I thought something was right, you could not back me down, and I'd argue with anyone over it. I had that strong sense of my own, my own point of view. And if it clashed with my dad's, well, so be it. I was going to clash with my dad, and I did. And a lot of it came from his own struggle to fit into a society that didn't really want him there.
And it was also, I suppose, the Jamaican kind of way is very staunch, very just deal with it, isn't it? It's like, so he came from that, and he had a tough childhood as well.
Yeah, my dad came from a very tough childhood.
Same as your mum.
Yeah.
Very poor.
Desperately poor. My mum was way poorer than my dad, and my dad was poor. And my dad lost both his parents when he was young. So showing affection was difficult for him. He was raised by an aunt who wasn't particularly affectionate, would care and all of those things in a practical sense. But my dad was not a man for,
Hugs.
oh, I love you, and give me a hug. No way, that was not my dad. Me, hug all the time, very tactile, always wanting to show that I love, I'm very demonstrative like that. My dad wasn't anything like that. And so me and my dad would clash. Initially, me and my mum would clash because we're very similar personalities, both quite fiery, and both would stand up for what we believed in, but they were only minor, really. Frequent, but minor. My dad and I clashed heavily. When we clashed, it was heavy. And that made for a loving home, but also a complex home, because we didn't feel as though we didn't have money. That wasn't the issue, or anything like that. And we would sit and discuss things as a family. In a lot of ways, we were quite middle class. Middle
You're
class.
very middle class compared to me.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't come from a council estate. We didn't come from all the stereotypes that are associated with
but there was
black
obviously in
families.
Wolverhampton. Bev was obviously from Wolverhampton.
The industrial Midlands, and our family life was secure, but there were battles, and a lot of it did come from just my poor dad's struggle to see these children growing up in a way that he wasn't comfortable with. When my sister brought my now brother-in-law home, oh my God, he was silently seething, and then the seethingness turned into a resentment, because he didn't want. It was one thing to have your white friends come around and play and all of that stuff. It's quite another to bring a white boyfriend home with very serious intentions. Oh my God, that was a struggle. And my sister wasn't vocal in the way that I was. So I would be fighting my sister's battles for her, because I was the mouthy one who would never back down. So as a result, Dad and I would clash. It was difficult. It really was. It was difficult.
Do you now thinking back to your journey from there and after that, has that dynamic had any implications for you? Did it define you? Did it give you strengths, or did it cause issues later down?
When I think back now of that period, I think what it did for me was made me even more resilient. I think that's the best thing I can say. I was so convinced that my attitude to other people, except, as they say in the Midlands, you take people as you find them, and I was so convinced that that was the right way. And Dad's entrenched views that became hardwired for him just turned me right the other way, and I was determined to throw my mind and my heart open to all kinds of everyone.
Do you think that as well, that came from your mum as well? Because
my mum is way more...
Beverly's mum was like my mum. She was the synergy as well, was the one that was there holding everything together, and and obviously my situation was different, but it's...
Mum, I think, mum's influence was a factor as well, because while I saw my dad kind of destroy a part of himself because he struggled so much, on the other hand, I saw how my mum coped with the prejudices, whether they were casual or confrontational, that came her way, and her way was to
kill with kindness.
Yeah, kill them with kindness, and to grow.
Yeah, that's what Bev now does.
I guess
and that's the difference in us. Yeah, but that's the difference in us. I'm more... I think men are. I just think men are. I think men are more like, reactive to that. But Beverly will be a bit, more. Oh no, let's be a bit kinder sometimes. But then it's weird. But then sometimes it worked the other way, won't it? So it's weird. When you're a couple, sometimes you feed off the. Yeah, it's weird.
But I think
it's made you strong. It's made you strong.
Oh my God, yes.
But he, your dad didn't talk a lot, did he? He was, but about feelings and everything. You get him talking about youngsters, and he'd be there for 4 hours telling you about the state of the world.
Long-winded. My dad could talk.
Beverly
forever.
Also isn't a massive talker about her feelings, are you? Sometimes, so that's a.
I tend to, that's something I didn't really realise what I'd inherited from my dad until I met you, and you pointed out so much of what I've inherited. My inability to speak of deep-seated feelings. I will speak of them in song, because that is a much more general thing, and when you're writing a song, you want to make the message universal whilst you're basing it on your own feelings. You still want to, you generalize things so that the widest demographic of people can understand what you're singing about. But for me to get really personal and just really go there and talk about things that are bothering me, often I will just sit on those things, just like my dad. Exactly like my dad.
Me, on the other hand,
you let it all out.
I did, and that was when I was so. Then I might as well take this into when I was young. My mum and dad split up when I was young. We moved around a bit from London to Norwich, and back and forth. And my dad, unbeknown to me at the time, was an alcoholic. So he used to let me down a lot, when I was very young, and used to promise a hell of a lot. And always let me down, birthdays, coming down, and my mum would always have to deal with the aftermath. Yeah, exactly, and it wouldn't be good. I was an angry kid, apparently from 2 onwards. Don't know why. I was a nightmare.
You probably feel the energy in the house.
I don't know. But my dad was a very manipulative man as well. He literally nearly drove my mum mentally round the twist. That's why she had to leave him.
Your dad was a charmer, from what you tell me.
He was a charmer, yeah.
Very handsome, charming. Yeah. But there was the flip side.
But yeah, and I don't think he meant it horribly. I just think he was quite manipulative, but great dad when we were young, like your dad. Amazing when we were young, and we remember some brilliant things about them, and that they were. My dad was a fantastic storyteller. Beverly's dad was really involved in when they were young, but then your dad kind of lost his way a bit, didn't he? Just went in on himself and withdrew himself a lot. My dad, just the drinking got worse, he got very ill. I then got kicked out of my house living with my mum when I was 15. Went to live with my dad. He kicked me out 4 months later as well, and then died about a year later. So, you know, very, very difficult times. And I was a very insecure child. My mum would, you know, I was very worried about my mum as well. You know, I hated her being in on her own, so I wouldn't go out. I'd stay with my mum. I was a very
protective.
But I was a very emotional child, either very angry or very sad, or you know, it was just one or the other. You know, it was, and that anger came out in a lot. I did a lot of bad things when I was young, and always in trouble with the police and school, and you know, I used to do crazy things, you know, as a young kid. And I think I didn't have a role model. My dad was an alcoholic, my brother was an idiot of foot fighting, and he was my role model, and I wanted to be like him. Terrible role model, bless him, you know. And it's not his fault, he was dealing with his own stuff as well, so I could never judge him and think, well, at the time I wanted him to look after me and be he was dealing with his own problems when my dad died, and you know, he also got kicked out because he was a nightmare at my mum. So it was this vicious cycle, and I think when my dad died, I just lost it completely.
Yeah, you went, didn't you?
Yeah, I didn't care about myself, and that was, I think, and this is the difference between me and Beverly. She's had so much respect for herself as a person. I had absolutely zero. I didn't care whether I lived or died, and that came across in everything I did.
And I suppose conversely, I cared so much.
Yeah.
I cared about making my mark on the world, because I knew from I was tiny I was going to sing, and no one was going to tell me I couldn't sing, so I couldn't sing. And that was what I was going to do.
That was your strength of mind, and you've still got, you know.
Yeah, it's what propelled me forward. But I had, even though my dad had his struggles, I did not doubt that I was a loved child, even with the clashes, even with the fights. Equally, I didn't doubt that my mum and dad loved each other, even with their clashes. And even with, I mean, their relationship sometimes to us kids was comedic, because my mum would just be telling my dad, you know, what to do and things, and my dad was quite a reserved man. But we always knew that there was love there, and there was never, the conflict was because of situations that would arise that we'd have to tackle. It wasn't inherent to the relationship, if that makes sense. Whereas I think with your mum and dad,
we went through so much.
It sounds
my mum, bless her, now is still upset at what she put us through, and I'm like, you know, Mum, no, you know, you didn't put us through that. It's just a circumstance, you know, and I wouldn't change. And this is bringing it on to the whole, mental kind of awareness side of things, and I wouldn't change any of it, because it's made me as strong as it has made me weak, and that vulnerability and that strength are both important. And I wouldn't have that now. And the same.
They sit side by side.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest lesson that we can learn. That I have to look back on everything the same as Beverly does, and we look at the bad as good. You know, is as important, if not more important, than the good, because you learn and you get resilient, you get strong, and you toughen. Maybe not in the best way sometimes, but. You know, I think it drives you sometimes, but then we've talked before, then my mind goes somewhere else, and I then think, well, actually, I wouldn't mind have grown up in cotton wool, not having any problems.
Not having to go through what you did.
Yeah.
And then what kind of an adult would you have been?
I don't know, I might be really nice, I might be really sensible, but, you know, we don't know, you know, and I don't, you know, but we are what we are now, and we just have to accept it, love it, and just move on.
Your message is, you know, you can't change the past. No, you can learn from it, you can take energy from it and positive lessons.
It has to be,
but you can't
energy.
let it haunt you.
No, and
That's the problem.
We've both had, you know, not very nice things happen to us, you know, and equally in different ways and different, and the other thing is everyone's journey, like people might watch this and go, well, they might be saying my situation's worse than mine. Well, to you, yes, and to me, mine was worse, or, you know, yours, it doesn't matter. It's not a competition. We just have to look at ourselves and go, it happened, learn from it, accept it, love it, and move on, and just try and
a lot of the
grow.
way, it's the only way you can deal. Otherwise, things can consume you.
Oh,
I
massive,
watched the resentment of how my dad was treated, and believe you me, it wasn't good the way he was treated. I watched that consume him over the years. As a child, I get that now. As I'm you know, I'm an adult now. I understand that what was happening to my dad was this slow inner destruction of a man who was inherently a loving and decent and hard-working man, but could not let go of his resentment for how he was treated when he came to Britain.
So the other thing is,
hard.
you remember so much of your childhood, because you know, and
but it was a good childhood. That's why I remember.
Yeah, and there's so many chunks of my childhood that I've got no idea.
Like
Absolutely,
That's how you coped.
And
That's
I think,
how you
and
dealt
that,
with
exactly
it.
that. I think now that's my coping mechanism. That I just seemingly blocked it out, and I think there's certain things I remember about my dad and my mum, and you know, but I remember being loved by my mum. You know, my dad, I know he loved me, but you know, it's always that letting down, and that impacted me. The promising thing when we got together, wasn't it?
Yeah.
You know, it was one of the things that when we got married, I finally could say to Bev, I promise, you know, to give myself to you, because before that I struggled to say I promise, because I just felt I couldn't. So that impacted me from my dad.
Yeah, because your dad made a lot of promises to you that you didn't keep.
I'm very careful about very careful, because
promise it. You have a real thing about the word promise.
To my nephews and anything, 'cause if I say I promise I'll be there, and anything can happen, I'll do my best to be there, is a better thing I would use. If I could give any advice to a parent, and I'm not a parent, I would say don't use the word promise.
Just in case.
Yeah, because anything can happen, you know.
Yeah.
So.
And kids see things really binary. They do not. You said you were going to be there.
Right.
Well, there was a car accident.
Yeah, someone died in front. It could be anything.
But you
they don't
said
care.
you were going to be there.
Yeah, they don't see it.
That's what kids understand.
I mean, for kids, the parents are, you know, the absolute reference points.
Absolutely.
The parents stand for the truth, and parents can't lie, and parents can't do wrong.
Yeah.
And then when you
until they do,
and then when it happens,
and then when you realize,
it's really confusing then for children who are not yet at an age where they can actually make sense of that.
How do they process it?
Exactly.
I was super angry with my mum. I hated my mum for a period. I hated my sister, you know, my brother. I've been through all different, you know, and then obviously, you know, my dad dying young. I was so angry about everything. I was just angry all the time, and then, you know, we get into our kind of 20s, and then my real problems started, you know, with I think with the self-torture was like, well, I need to get out of how I feel out of my life, and drugs came along. You know, obviously drinking. I was drinking from a young age, from 13 years old I was drinking, you know, and doing crazy things from that age upwards, and then drugs at 18. And then it got really bad, you know. I was, you know, at 21, I was walking at the top of a multi-storey car park thinking, what's the point, you know? And that's genuinely, that low has been, you know, and nearly dying of drugs 2 or 3 times, you know, of being in that point where you know, and just not caring, you know, and it's a tough, it's a weird situation, and
it's terrifying.
There is, you know, there is very clear indications or correlations from research substance misuse, addiction runs through generations. So with and nobody really knows, you know, is there a genetic component or is it a learned behavior? But when you saw your father, you experienced your father and how he was. And that must have impacted you. Plus you said, you know, with low self-esteem and not really any positive outlook on life, turning to drugs, to alcohol is also a coping mechanism. Not a good one, but you were trying to cope.
Yeah, the other thing I had when I was young was I was always told, because I was a fat kid as well, so I always had that. I always felt like a failure, you know, and I always. You know,
you didn't have any teachers who really would encourage you.
I had some good teachers,
but mostly school and teaching was not a positive force in your life.
But I was so naughty, so I was so bad that they couldn't do much with me because I was so angry and so violent.
But nobody sought to look beyond that and understand what was fueling that. It seems to me anyway.
But you can't, you know.
But you were in a vicious cycle.
But they can't. I don't. But a teacher's got 30 other kids. How are they going to, you know? And I was the one kid, so they just send me out, you know, and that was it. And I'd do crazy things at school, you know, and I was, constantly fighting and.
That money.
Oh, that's bad. Yeah. You know, I used to steal school money and stuff, you know, and all sorts, just bad, you know. I was that kid at school, the worst in the year, you know. I just had and it's the lack of self-respect I had, but I didn't know, I just didn't care. I was like, I don't care about any, you know, I don't care. That was my, you know.
So you didn't reflect or try to understand just why you feel this way?
Just anger.
Just,
outward anger.
It's
and
I didn't have that.
No,
I didn't have any of that.
You were loved and told you were brilliant. And I was told I was rubbish my whole school life.
And this is the thing. I was told from I was little, from that my primary school teacher, Mrs. Barnard, God love her, she's still with us, and she told my mum and dad, who would go to parents' evening, they both would turn up together. But I was told, Beverly's special. She has a very special voice. She's very hardworking. Blah blah blah. She's gonna do special things. I was a young child. I was like, I'll take that. I believed it because that's what people said, and I had that all the way through school. So I believed that I was going to do something special, and I knew it was to do with my voice. You know, but what it did was it drove me to be the best pupil. So I became that bookish kid, always reading and studying. I had the glasses to go with it. I looked every bit the geeky student. I mean, that was me.
But there's also a lot of pressure on that as well, putting all that pressure on a child as well. So even though you could say, oh, well, they were wrong for saying it to me, were they wrong for saying that to Beverly? Because that's a lot of pressure to put on a child mentally, because if she doesn't succeed in that...
Oh, if I hadn't have succeeded,
or
if I had failed in my studies...
Exactly. So
it would not have been it wouldn't have worked out very well for me. There was an expectation that I would do well at school. Luckily I did.
It did work out for you. Yeah, but if you put that pressure on 10 kids, how many of them are going to be
buckle under the pressure?
And whereas I refused to do homework, I didn't want to do it, and I was like, it just didn't make sense to me, you know, none of it. I was like, but I think that's just as hard sometimes, to put all that pressure on a child. So I don't know where that balance is.
And that's generally, I mean, that's with raising kids, that's with mental health as well, generally. There's no one size fits all.
Exactly.
Everybody is different. And
you know,
has a different baseline resilience as well to cope with different things in life. And it would be an interesting thought experiment to, you know, reverse your roles. If you had grown up in an environment like James and vice versa, who knows what would have come out.
I never want to put that on Bev though.
Oh my God. But imagine me always arguing with your mum. Oh no.
No, when you were young.
When I was young, I never shut up arguing. I was always arguing. I was always preaching the gospel of Bev, because I was always right.
I used to, yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it was. So I think then, you know, so it was funny then, we laughed sometimes when we look at when we were 21, let's say, let's pick, you know, a 21-year-old Beverly and a 21-year-old James. Well, the 21-year-old Beverly was...
First album, finishing uni, writing the first album, writing my dissertation at the same time.
I was dealing drugs, taking a huge amount of drugs and basically fighting and being an idiot and going out 7 nights a week. That was it.
It was mad. But yet there's so many things that we didn't know each other, obviously, but there were so many things that we shared, you know, that were completely in common. Fathers that were tricky, silly things. We used to watch the same kids programs.
Yeah.
You know, we both loved, I don't know, cars and stuff, and just silly things that we would have in common.
Yeah.
That even though our lives seemed so different, there was a lot of similarities, and I think that can give you comfort as well, because you can see someone's life as being so privileged and so far and so remote from your own, and yet there are still parallels with that life that you can draw, because on the surface our lives nothing like each other, but
I love
in
that.
some ways there's things that we went through that were the same.
But I like the fact that, like, you know, some people talk about when you're with someone, like Beverly doesn't drink or smoke, and she never has, and I've done, you know, all of it. So it's like, but I'd never want Bev to do that. I'd never want her to experience all of that, because it doesn't make you any better. You know, it's not like, oh yeah, do that, and it doesn't make you any better. It doesn't improve your life, and you don't know where you can go this is just to carry on with that. This is my problem with drink, drugs, cigarettes, all of that. You don't know until you do it what your problem is going to be. That's a very, very important fact, and that I feel. I'm not saying that it's a fact but how I feel about it. You don't know until you take that first bit of it how it's going to affect you. Some people can do it and then recreationally. Some people like me, who are a maniac and wouldn't be the last one, you know. And to meet someone like Beverly that didn't do any of that, it was like an absolute breath of fresh air to me, because I was just like, oh my God, you know, this.
Because it's unusual also.
But it was beautiful.
Most people would have got their share of experience.
Yeah, but it was inspirational for me as well, and it really made me look at myself and think, you know what, and Bev inspired me, and she still does, to be a better human being, to be, you know, more caring, and to you know, think better of people and not judge, and all of these things, you know. And
but then I look, because I didn't go through any of that. I was raised in this, it wasn't super strict, but, you know, I had boundaries, but it was defined by Christianity. My parents were both Christians, and that was the way we were raised. And that wasn't the reason I didn't smoke or drink, because everyone in my family will drink, but hardly anything. But I just hated alcohol. I didn't like how people were around it, and I certainly wasn't going to smoke, because I was going to do anything to damage my voice. But equally, when I look at James's life and see what he went through, but still had enough determination to pull himself out of the mire to do something, because you had enough. You had the moments of clarity to know that either I sort myself out or get away from this druggy scene, or I'm going to be dead or in prison.
And there was a moment in your 20s, James, that where you turned things around. How was the process for you? Was it a moment of clarity? Did you wake up one morning after binge, deciding that it can't go on like this? How did you find the strength? What went through your mind at the time?
It's difficult to say exactly what the catalyst was, and we spoke earlier, and it's difficult for me to say what works and what doesn't work, because obviously, as we said as well, we're all completely different. But I think an important thing is separating yourself from the situation. And I managed to blag a job in London, and it goes back again to what we talked about, the law of attraction-esque type thing, where I always used to say when I was young, as a cocky like 15-year-old, I'll be back in London before I'm 25 and blah, blah, blah. Because, you know, I was cocky because I was so insecure. So, you know, I used to try and mask it. And I managed to blag the job, but I was £7,000 in drug debt to drug dealers who wanted to hurt me, who wanted to hurt my girlfriend at the time, their family. They were going to do something bad to the house, so I had to just get away. And I had a bin bag full of clothes, and I moved to London, and that was 19 years ago. And it was a very slow process. You know, I was very unhealthy. You know, I smoked, I drank, I did drugs, I ate crap. You know, all the usual. And I just joined a gym where I worked, and it just was a slow process. And then as I went, luckily, I'm 100% or nothing person, and that's what got me through it, because I then focused on something else, and then with that focus, it washed away the other stuff. So and
focus was exercise.
Was exercise, and then wanting to become, was then to self-educate myself, because I wasn't educated when I'm still not, but I started reading more, and I started to try and read self-help books and trying to educate myself and strive for better things, you know, to try and buy some property, and these little incremental steps I was making, you know, I still had no one theoretically helping me, because you know, my mum was just doing her thing. Obviously, you know, we still had contact, but we had a lot of years we didn't. And you know, I just worked. All I had was hard work, and I just did that, and that was what took me through. You know, there's no magic thing that I can think, oh, that was. But I think it was just not wanting to be in that situation anymore.
Well, I think the minute you knew it had come down to the wire, you know, it was either I leave now or I'm never leaving, because I'll be in a jail or
I do remember, yeah, because I know
under the ground.
At 22, I think I nearly went to prison anyway, and I think then, you know, with a couple of other things that happened and the you know, the bad stuff, it was a very toxic environment. So, you know, but I think you have to look at yourself like that, but it's hard when you're young as well, because they're your friends and that's your group, and that's what your mind knows. That's all it knows, and you know, and I was so used to being in trouble and doing stupid things, and you know, driving around with like thousands of pills in the car and just crazy things where it didn't, you know, I had no care at all for anything. And you know, but yeah, the positive side was, I think that comes from my mum. I think that was, my mum's voice was always in my head. I think if you've not got that, you know, there's probably kids out there now or who haven't got at least one person giving them something. And even though I wasn't talking to my mum, that voice was still there, that good, you know, that good and bad. My mum was there, yeah, you know, and it was my mum. And that's important, you know. But
your dad was a grafter as well.
He wasn't. Well, he was. He was.
No, he was, yeah. when you know, because he was doing when he was working, he was doing his carpentry.
Yeah, but
he did really good work.
He did do great work, but he enjoyed the pub more.
Yeah, but
he used to say that his best work was done in the pub.
But
I'm pretty sure for people out there that's not true.
That's probably not true. But his work was great work.
Oh, he's amazing. He's an amazing joiner.
And I think you have that same thing of, if you're going to do something, you'll do it and make sure it's damn good.
Definitely.
And the details.
It's an illness,
so you have inherited that from your dad.
Yeah, and my mum.
And oh God, yeah. And your mum.
Yeah.
Your mum is definitely a details woman.
Yeah. But, you know.
Yeah, my it's funny because you'd listen to this and think, oh yeah, Bev's life was fine. A few problems with your dad, but where it went a bit wonky woo for me was I chose when I say horrible, horrible relationships, I mean, I got myself into rubbish.
And that was around the same times, wasn't it? When you were, you know, in our early 20s was when you had, yeah.
You know, I didn't do that whole dating thing all the way through school because my focus was, like I said, I was a geek.
Boys weren't interested.
I was not really. I was interested in this.
Me, on the other hand,
yeah,
but anyway.
exactly. But you know, my first serious relationship was a man who was much older than me, and at 17, that's a big deal. Who was charming and manipulative and could be very aggressive. He tried it once to be physical with me and never again. Because I had enough character to fight back and saw what it was and thought, okay, this needs to end.
That's why I don't mess with her. So I wake up in the night with something in, I'll be like... Yeah.
And then the next relationship was worse than that. I literally went out of a frying pan into a fire, chose someone who was so possessive and so jealous of, I think, the fact that I was a popular person and could get on easily with people, and he just wasn't that kind of a man because he had his own issues with his own.
How old was
thing.
that again? What?
I was at when I jumped from the frying pan into the fire. I was at uni.
Right. And
this was during.
And was he? How old was he then? I can't remember.
Only 2 years older than me.
And I think that's something we forget as well. That when boys at that age, because you're still a boy, whatever you try and think.
He was. When I think back now, he was still.
That possessiveness is just insecurity, and that, you know, and it would be one of the things I'd love to do in the future is to work with younger men, children, young, you know, and to
insecure men is a tough one.
But we all are at that age, and so when there's a woman, we want to control her because we're insecure, and we all do it. I think most men do, you know, or most boys do, and then that then makes the woman or the girl insecure as well sometimes, or not insecure, but then.
Well, what I was going to go on to say is that in that relationship, something quite unique happened to me, which has only happened maybe once since that time, and that was instead of looking at this guy and thinking, oh, you have issues with your family setup, which is why you are the way you are, I accommodated his behavior by trying to appease it. So, I'll be home at 8. I would break my neck to be home from wherever I was at 8 o'clock. And this is in my uni years. So, you know, you're at uni, you're out with your mates, you maybe you've studied late with some friends or not, or you've gone out for a meal or whatever. I'd do everything to be home at 8, and it became pathological. I must be home at 8 because if I'm home at 8:05, there's going to be a problem, and I'm going to be accused of being here, there, and everywhere with people I was not with. So, and my character started to change. I began to withdraw and began to be what people said, not when I was there, but people described me more like you became a mouse. You were like a mouse. Me, who was always confident and always, you know, so forthright with my views and you know, and happy-go-lucky, became this mouse. And it took me signing my record deal, which happened in my final year of uni when I got spotted singing in a club at home. Very, very, very brief story. Got spotted before I went to uni, singing in a club. I was offered a deal. I turned down the opportunity to sign there and then because I said that I knew I was good, precocious, knew I was good, and if you thought I was as good as you claim you say, then you'll wait for me to finish uni.
And they did.
And they waited. Oh my God. Well, they waited till my final year. And
Let's not forget though how had your struggles with your own image as well, though, didn't you? Your own body
Oh yeah. Oh
image
no.
and-
I'll go on to that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which
No,
you
I'll
were
go on.
dealing
I
with
would
in
definitely.
them years as well,
It didn't
weren't
really manifest until a bit later, like
Okay.
badly. But yeah, with this guy, the thing that got me away from him was my first single that I had written and was released while I was at my final year of uni, took off like a rocket in the clubs, in the specialist clubs underground, which meant they needed an album, which meant I needed to write one, which meant I needed to hurry up, finish my degree, get my exams done, get to London and get writing. He still had a year to go because he was training to be a teacher. The minute I was able, I was gone to London.
So
back.
You got a lifeline through that record.
That was
deal,
my
basically.
that was my lifeline, and I was gone and left him behind.
That's another thing about my situation. It's getting yourself away from it sometimes.
Sometimes you have to remove yourself physically.
And that's the only way to do it.
Yeah.
When you're in such a relationship, and the way that you describe these partners, very charming, then manipulative. At the beginning, you were taken in by
Completely.
it, and then over time, very subtly, some character, starts.
I don't know how
through.
you put up with me, then,
but it's
honey.
really, but it's really hard to put the finger on it. So it becomes kind of a new normality, and when there are issues. In the relationship, you doubt yourself, you question yourself, you question your own reality.
That's exactly what happened. I was doubting myself, and I was managing my own behavior to appease a mind which was troubled.
You often see that in relationships where a partner is a narcissist, for example.
Yeah.
And it's really, really hard to get out of that, because in one way you still love that person, you try to accommodate, you're always also anxious because you don't know how they will react if you do this or that. Some people at some point they realize, okay, I have to leave. Others don't survive such relationships.
Exactly.
It's also having
Destroy
another
themselves.
option, but it's also having the option of going somewhere.
Where else do you go?
Exactly. And
I
that's
had
why,
somewhere to go. I
yeah,
had a
but that's
whole
why these women's shelters are so
life
amazing, aren't they?
well, exactly.
Yeah.
That's why I had a future, I had a life, and I had this thing in the back of my head. You do not factor in the long term, because this behavior isn't going to work when I'm touring the world, because I'd already, as far as I'm concerned, I'd planned all of that. That was going to be my life, the end. So I knew if I got away, I could see the road was going to be much clearer for me.
That's where I have the...
And I did.
Yeah, that's where I have the huge respect for my mum. She walked away
Your
from
mum
my
did
dad.
the same thing.
3 kids, no help.
Yeah, no one helped your mum.
Moved away and had to start off in a council house that was an absolute rat hole, and she just worked and
She
hard,
grafted
and
hard.
she grafted, and we had nothing, and no food, jumble sales, for clothes,
food,
all
for
of that,
clothes.
and it that stuff stuck with me like now, isn't it? I can't,
Yeah, you still now you won't go through a sale where you've
can't
got to
go
do
through a
this
sale.
through the rails,
Mentally, I
because
can't.
it brings you right back to.
And I have to, at home
Jumble
I had to
sale.
make our kitchen. I had to make 2 fridges and have stuff in there, because when we were young, I'd go in the fridge and there'd be nothing in there, and it still stuck with me. It's weird.
And I never had that.
I know,
I was
yeah.
so
That's-
fortunate. So
It's weird to go, but yeah,
It's
that whole
funny.
moving up, taking yourself out of something to, Bev did it, I did it, my mum did it. People can do it.
my mum and dad did it. They had
Exactly,
to
they
take
moved
themselves
away,
from
exactly.
Jamaica, because Jamaica was not going to, at that time, was not going to give them the life that either of them wanted. And the British government was saying, please come to Britain to help build the mother country up. But of course, they both made huge decisions at very young ages to leave everything they knew to come to Britain and give it a go. And the result of which is I'm sitting here, which I'm grateful for. But that thing of, okay, this is it. It's crunch time. I either stay in this situation and life will never get better, never improve, or I must leave, I must go. Luckily, I had something to go to, and I knew what it was.
It's scary, though. It's scary to...
It was scary.
It's scary to, for everyone. It's even hard to leave a job or to leave, for the unknown. Always the unknown's worse than what you think it is, and that, I suppose, if that's one takeaway I can say, because I'm still, the stuff I'm doing in this day and age, Beverly is doing some great stuff, and she's still doing stuff that she hasn't done before, and some amazing stuff, and putting herself new things, and that's scary for Beverly. And I'm doing the same thing in business and trying to start up new things, and that's scary at 43, to be going, I'll try this again, and it's mad,
Especially when I had this core belief, and you had the core belief that it was gonna work out, but you didn't see what the plan was. There wasn't a set plan or a set journey.
And uncertainty is
it's
scary.
uncertainty. And initially, to carry on about the recording contract and everything, that first deal didn't work out the way I wanted because I had creative differences with the record label, and then eventually left the label, but it was a protracted situation legally, and I had to start all over again. And there were times where my family were like, Bev, forget, just come home. Come home. You've always got
We were talking about that with them
home.
the other day, weren't we? That literally her brother-in-law and sister were like, we wanted her to come home.
They wanted me to come home and
said,
just
"No,
forget it." I was
no,
like, I'm not doing it.
here."
I'm staying here. I have to tough it
They
out.
wanted you to come home because they were worried about
They were
you.
worried
They love her
sick
and care,
about
and
me.
that, she had nothing, it was literally start again with,
I had to start again with everything.
living in someone's house that was just putting her
Who
up.
was an
and she was on her
acquaintance.
own, tough times, and she just toughed it
And
out with strength of mind.
my mum and dad wanted me to come back home. My family, but I didn't want to go back home, because going back home meant I had failed. I hadn't achieved what I set out to do, and that was music. And inside of me, that still small voice said, but that's your destiny. That is what you're meant to do. You can't go home. You'll be throwing destiny, of
for
course.
you that I probably haven't asked, sorry to, but
Go on.
is there anyone that you wanted to prove that to, apart from yourself, really? Because there's certain people I think back in my life, my mum or whatever, I think, I want to prove that I can do,
No,
You didn't really have that, did you, so much? Yeah.
Because everyone around me knew that I was capable of making a success of my career. Everyone, and no one doubted that I would. But the only thing for me was, I knew I had a hard road ahead of me. I knew there were going to be obstacles because of my sex, because of my race, because I was British and not American, making music which ultimately started its roots in America. I knew I had hurdles, and I just wanted to keep going.
I think that's the immigrant way as well, because my dad Irish, so I'm part of an immigrant as well, and Bev's obviously an immigrant, family. So I think that there's a certain work ethic.
There's a psychology there, isn't there?
There's a
resilience coming
there
from
is,
that,
and there's to strive, and I think we talked earlier about the journey, in life. It's very difficult at a young age to think, the journey is the important thing, but it really is. But you've got to have that goal, but you've got to live in that moment as well. So you've got all these contrasting views and opinions and things you've got to think about. And when you're young, it's very difficult to be grounded enough to go, I'll think of the future and set my goals so high, but I'll just bring it back to now. So it's like, it's very difficult.
It's always the dynamic between the journey and where we want it to lead us. You mentioned music as your destiny, and you felt that from a very, very early age.
Absolutely.
So music as your destiny, but in how far was music also for you a tool or an outlet or a mechanism to actually see you through that journey with its struggles, some of which we've talked about? Was it a source of strength for you that you could harness?
Music has always been the cathartic. It's always been where I've gone to work it all out. If I need to sort it out, there's a song for it. Either I'm going to write it or someone brilliant has written it for me and I'm going to sing it, and I'm going to take their words and I'm going to put it into my voice and I'm going to sing it, and it's going to somehow help me to figure stuff out.
Words have always meant a lot to you.
Words are so important. Melody has always been there because that's always been my go-to. I was singing before I was talking. So everyone tells me, my mum, my play school teachers, everyone says, yeah, Bev was singing before she was talking. But then the power of the lyric took over. I first saw the power of the lyric, I guess, through my religious upbringing, because people would always read out the lyrics to hymns and say, and now listen to this, and this is so important, and you know, and this is the message that God wants to tell you, and blah, blah, blah. And putting all that, putting all of the God stuff aside, the power of the word and the message, and you couple that with a melody, and suddenly you've got something that can reach far beyond what we can easily explain. And so music was my go-to. When I was happy, it was music. When I was sad, it was music. Everything. And it wasn't just music to listen to, it was what I would sing. So I started to write when I was around 13. The minute I could really get some sense out of the piano, then I started to write songs. Rubbish songs, but it was my way of trying to, it was my catharsis, you know? It was where I went to work everything out, and still
different
now.
than mine.
Yeah, you turned to other things. I always turned to music. And I'm fortunate that I had this gift that, you know, landed in my lap at birth of music, because if music wasn't there, what else would I have turned to? It was always there, and it was so immediate. All I had to do was open my mouth and just sing. And I realized just how lucky, you know, I was and I am to have that. But what was important to me was that I could share that with other people, that in writing my songs, I could then, while I'm working stuff out for myself, maybe I'm making sense to somebody else out there. That was my hope.
And you have, I mean, the letters Beverly gets, and the well wishes and the love that she gets, and it, you know, it impacts me because I see that, and I'm so proud that my wife is doing that for people. And
you don't always realise it.
It's made me a better person. Honestly, all these little things have made me a better person, and I get some real warmth through that when I read someone's, you know, a letter Beverly gets, or, you know, and a card, and it's beautiful.
Or a little tweet or something.
Or you know, just nice things, you know.
It's funny because I always felt, and again, along with the bad choices of relationships, I started to, when I first came to London, and, you know, I was with my deal and everything, and my second deal, that is, and things really started to take off commercially, you know, into the mainstream. That was when I really started to feel like I was a square peg in a round hole. Because I didn't think like I didn't look like a pop star. I didn't speak like a pop star. There were so many prejudices and stereotypes that fed into that. I wasn't an American.
Looking back now, do you think that obviously that being in the public eye, you know, just it made that 200 times bigger, that feeling? So that was your right. When that's what people don't realise, isn't it? That we go through these insecurities when we're young. They're big enough, but then when you're thrust into the public eye, people then looking at you as the...
Oh, they're looking at you, they're examining you from head to toe.
And your record label telling you stuff, and, you know, that you're too this or too that, or you need to be sexier. And that was one of the things that I respected about Beverly when I met her, that she didn't give in to any of that. She was her own woman, good or bad, detrimental or not to her career. She has been who she is. Yeah, it was detrimental that she wasn't taking drugs, that she wasn't going to the parties, that she wasn't out, you know, having sex with everyone, you know, all of these things, and wanting to do all the skimpy outfits and flaunt herself. That.
Well, that's staying true to yourself.
But that's so.
It was so hard to be that square peg in the round hole.
So you processed that in a song with the same name,
that was the
right?
only thing. That's right.
Really
I wrote
wicked
that song.
I love that song.
I wrote that song.
It's powerful.
Because that's all I could do. I was part of this industry that I just did not feel that I easily slotted into. There was no doubt of the musical ability. I never doubted that ever, and I never have. But there was no tribe into which I fit. And there is still no tribe into which I fit.
That can feel quite lonely.
And it was lonely. It was.
And I felt that in different ways in my childhood
in your
and
own,
20s. So yeah,
in your own way.
And that's one of the things that we talk about, the synergy in our lives. We go, oh, well, I didn't fit in there, or I didn't feel quite good enough, or this enough, or, you know, and that came out in different ways, and, you know, for each other. It's an interesting, yeah.
But talking about life in the spotlight, it's a lot of people, be it, you know, singers, actors, even politicians, people who are in the public spotlight, always feeling that scrutiny, judgment, because not everybody will love you. It's just how it is, and that creates a lot of pressure. Outside pressure, and a lot of people in the spotlight will internalize that, and you know, it can feed their own insecurities. So again, if you talk about research, statistics, and all that, somebody who lives a life in the public spotlight like you do is purely statistically much more at risk for mental health issues, for drugs and alcohol, prescription medication often also. Just to come down after a gig, to deal with adverse press, even if it's a tabloid just making something up out of context.
We've been there.
So you're experiencing that. How does this affect you emotionally? Because we've established you're staying away from mood-altering substances. You have a strong, you know, resilience. I can sense that just by sitting next to you and feel that power. But it must affect you. It
did. It was a kind of chipping away. The longer I was in London, the more I felt as though I just didn't fit in. I was, a black woman who was the wrong type of black, i.e. I wasn't light enough, I wasn't European looking enough, so that was an issue. And there, you know, I was pretty singular at the time. Coming out in my early years in making the music I make, there were very few people from Britain making that kind of music. Britpop was conquering the world, and then there was me. You know, it was an odd time. I didn't do all the mood altering things, and then I didn't look like my American counterparts. I wasn't the tough girl like Mary J. Blige, who was having phenomenal success. Equally, I wasn't the sexy girl like the SWV girls or you know, like TLC or you know, Ashanti or any of those kind of girls. And I was none of those. So because I didn't fit into any of those tribes easily or neatly, I was subject to a lot of ridicule. And some of that was in the press. And after a while, for someone who always had this strong sense of self, that began to chip away. And there was a period in my mid-20s where I look back now and I'm like, I can't even believe that was me. But I started to eat badly and not train. I'd always been so so full of fitness and saw fitness as fun and all of that. And I just stopped and then put on weight. And then that became an issue because the record label said, oh, well, now you're far too heavy. Far too heavy, size 12, but far too heavy. And to be fair, I looked at myself and I didn't look like the me that I had known all my life. And
the life in the spotlight has started to take its toll.
It started to really take its toll, and that was difficult to
personally. You had obviously things going on as well behind the scenes that were making you unhappy, and so it was all it's like the perfect storm, wasn't it? It was like
a perfect storm of how do you pull yourself out of it?
So how did you?
Well, I was lucky because I at that time I started to gather some decent people around me, some of which are still my friends today. But one particular person who I met at that tricky time was a guy called Tyrone, who was this flamboyant, gay man, black man, who just always smiling, always happy. What I didn't know is he was also HIV positive, didn't tell me at the time. But we met and I want to say fell in love, but not in a romantic sense. We just connected so quickly and so firmly. And I credit Tyrone from pulling me out of that slump because he saw the real me behind all the trying to put up with the press and their nonsense and the spotlight. He just saw Beverly. And
he's very like straight as well. I didn't know him, but he was like,
he died before.
Like to just tell you to fix up and get a skirt on and just get out.
I wouldn't wear trousers because I didn't want anything to distract from. I wouldn't wear a skirt because I didn't want anything to distract from my music and be taken seriously as a musician because oh my God, and they're just going to subjugate me and I'm a woman and he was like, you can be both. Get your pins out. They're great pins. Get them out. You relax. For God's sake, relax.
And it was only a short time.
It was. He was only in my life, relatively speaking, a short time.
But it was huge.
From 98, and then he passed away in 2003. But that was the period where I changed from, for the first time in my life, beginning to doubt myself because I didn't fit in the London scene and all the rest of it, into saying, I absolutely fit in. I've just created my own little area for my damn self. And it's just me on this lane. I've got my own lane and I'm staying in it and whatever to everybody else's lane. And he really was instrumental in helping me to find me again.
But it also was then one of the hardest times in your life. So that conversely, which is what you go through in life, like we always talk about, it made her way stronger at the time. It changed her life, and then when he died, obviously it ruined it, absolutely killed her. But she then had to fight back from that again, and then it's like
Tyrone was his HIV was advanced. I became his carer. He had, a bunch of fair weather type friends. He had some great friends as well, who are my friends to this day as well. But you know how it is under crisis, the fair weather people disappear. The really great people stay with you. And so he had a network of us who just helped him through. I became his primary carer. We lived together, and his health just declined and declined while and this is it was this weird juxtaposition of my career began to really take off. My third album, which was my second with my second deal, so it was album number 3 for me, album number 2 for that record label, which was Parlophone. that album absolutely took off. I was firmly in the mainstream and everything was going right, but behind the scenes, Tyrone, I was losing him, and I knew there was nothing I could do to God.
I know.
I couldn't save him, you know? But he had saved me, and that was the hard thing.
You tried though, she tried everything.
Oh, I tried.
She was
I tried,
amazing
but
to him.
ultimately,
And that was the thing, you know, you had to go through that. And sometimes, you know, in life, you have to go through that hardship to become a better person, to be a butterfly. You have to, and that's what Bev went through, and that was his role. And you have to take that in life sometimes, as people come and go, and that's their role in life, just like you are part of someone's journey. And if you can enrich someone's life, like I said to you earlier about trying to add value to every situation, I've worked so hard to try and do that, because I can be a bit of a nightmare sometimes. And I always say that, you know, there can only be one diva in a relationship, and that's me. You know, so it's the journey, isn't it? Again, you have to have these set things happen, you know, put them in a box and go, that was amazing or terrible or whatever, but I learned and I grew, and then you know, and that's
his purpose. I'm trying to find my tissue. His purpose in life, I can't find it somewhere. I believe that he was there. I was there to help him fulfill his dreams. He wanted to be a TV presenter. He ended up being a TV presenter. Because, you know, I managed to connect him to certain people, and there he was. You can YouTube him, and there he is. And he enabled me to be the very resilient and strong woman that I am now, which meant I was in the right place to meet James, and, you know, even though we met a few, I went through another cycle of nonsense, but it wasn't quite the same nonsense as when I was young. It wasn't. It didn't have that same dangerous thing. It was just nonsense. But it's just funny. At the what was the most wonderful part of my career at that time was also the hardest part of my life.
But that's also a beautiful thing of it. It's know, and that's the journey, isn't it?
That's
it's the mad.
It's also this notion of paying it forward. Yeah, I mean, from what he did for you, and I mean, you're very engaged in charitable work and
huge,
making
a huge contribution for, you know, a lot of people out there.
I honestly believe that yes, we all have our struggles, and I've had mine, but I am in this privileged position. I've grafted for it, but I am in this privileged position whereby I have a platform, and I will use that platform as much as I can. You have to pay it forward, because you have to. You know, Tyrone, even at his weakest physically, was enabling magic to happen for me because of how he really helped me to just reignite my self-esteem and and gave me a confidence in my physical being that I didn't have before.
You've hit the nail on the head about the magic thing. It's the value thing, isn't it?
It's
a friend of ours wrote a book, you know, called Creating Magic, Jason Bale. So you know, it talks about that is just, you know, looking beyond yourself and trying to do good for other people. And it's hard, particularly when you're going through a tough situation yourself, to try and look out for other people. And we've, as I said, we've both been through really tough times, and I've probably been more selfish because when I was younger, thought I was the victim of everything, you know. But
it's also a coping mechanism.
Yeah, but you have to come out of that. And the big thing I do now through reading and trying to grow my mind and you know, is extreme ownership. You know, is to look at yourself and to go, well, it's my doing. You're not blaming yourself, but it's my doing, and I'll deal with it, and I can, you know, progress everything. You know, if someone cuts you up, it's not them, it's you reacting. So you just got to, you know, process it, and that's what, you know. But as I said, it's a daily struggle to sometimes to, you know, but again, Beverly's a naturally, as we said, a naturally happy kind of, you know.
It's my disposition.
Yeah,
to be. To be
positive, and but me, I think through and I've got friends who've had similar upbringings, and you just have that kind of, it's a weird, it's like a defense mechanism. It is all the time, you know. It's almost going back to when we were cavemen. You think there's something around the corner going to kill you, and it seems like my brain's wired more for that. So I have to work at it, you know. I go cold water therapy, and you know, and I try and keep my thyroid in check, and you know, I've got an underactive thyroid, and obviously that affects me.
Hard.
Yeah, it affects, you know, it's a difficult thing to regulate, but.
So an underactive thyroid, it can really severely and sometimes suddenly impact your mood.
Yeah.
I can get sometimes I get very dark very quick.
Very quick, out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Out of nowhere. To me, it seems like it's come out of nowhere. Yeah. You've been everything and joking and laughing, and then you're not.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, whoa, where's that come from?
And
it's like a dark cloud has just sat on your head, and it's zoomed in out of nowhere, and it's just sat on your head, and then you have to fight to get out of that that blue.
But I think that's an important point as well, is you know, without knowing that there is this physical underlying thing under functioning thyroid, such a sudden mood change, it can have severe repercussions for both yourself and also your partner and the relationship. And I think it's important to keep in mind also that we as human beings, our emotions, they're also results of chemical processes in our brain. And sometimes it is very much a physical underlying issue. So feeling in a dark place, feeling sad, not coping, or
the fog as well. It's a weird. I mean,
sometimes you can't think clearly.
The health implications of an underactive thyroid. If you read them, you just want to go and jump off a building. They're horrific. You know, it's like suicidal thoughts. This, blah blah blah. So I just put that away and think no, and you know, weight gain, and I'm like, no, I'm not going to believe that. And this is again. I'm probably just obstinate, you know. I just want to, like, you know, you call me
Quincy Jones.
Yeah, well, no, you also call me contrary, because I'm like, I don't want to be the norm. I don't want to just, you know, if the underactive thyroid exists, no, I'm not going to be that. I'm going to try and get in good shape. I'm going to eat right. Because all of these things impact. I'm going to use cold water. I'm going to use breathing. I'm going to use meditation. And all of that stuff was so hard for me to do. And I try and do it on a daily basis.
But it seems to really help you to keep
It does. 100%.
It completely does.
100%.
It completely does.
Particularly the cold.
From standing watching you, I can say that when you, in the morning, when you go out, you take our dog out and you do that whole thing, and
I'm up early, you know, if I get up at 5:45 and I'm out and I do my thing before, then come back and then do my day, I've achieved something. And that's,
but it also centres you.
Yeah, 100%.
It rights you.
Yeah.
And when
the colder
you
the water is, it does.
Your cold water. Yeah, the colder the water, the happier he is.
Yeah.
And when he hasn't done that, the difference in the day, you always feel as though you're just a little bit discombobulated, energy under par.
The weird thing is, the other day,
I
mixed up taking my levothyroxine, and I took 25 micrograms too little, and I felt horrific for 3 days. And I've never had that much of a difference. I then switched up again to 150 a day, and I was instantly, I could think again. And I was like, and it was that quick. And that surprised me, because it catches me out still, you know, and that's a very difficult thing to deal with. But I'm not gonna bitch about it. I'm just gonna get on with it. I'm gonna have the processes, and I know I'm anal about stuff, sometimes, you know, like the blinds at home. Sorry, honey. You know, as I said, I've got my processes, I've got my systems, and you know.
He has his systems.
But that's a coping mechanism.
It's a coping mechanism, but I recognise it.
Yeah.
But she just lets me get on with it because she knows the house is spotless. I'm like
That's not too bad, is it?
Honestly,
Yeah.
I'm like,
There are upsides in everything. The fact that James has to have control of certain things and has to have things exactly in the right place and all of that means the house is always clean and tidy, and you just...
When we met,
you get on with
Bev
it.
came around to my flat for the first time. She thought I was the American Psycho guy because everything was in its place. All my clothes were lined up, ironed, everything. She was like,
all the lids were in the handles
and
of
I like to have things in a certain way in the cupboards and cupboards
I
for
was
right.
like,
Beverly doesn't have that. It's like, you know,
No.
I have to have. It has to feel right.
I'm sure that makes for an interesting dynamic at home.
It does.
But then again,
It
you know,
does.
you describing how you build a structure for your everyday life. You know, you get up at the time, you have your morning almost ritual, and it gives you that sense of achievement already in the morning that sets for a positive day. I think that's also an important message because having a structure, either because it's given or imposed on you, or even more importantly, when it's not, and you need to build your own structure. But actually having a daily structure is something very, very important.
It is, but it's equally though, and again, this is always where my mind goes to. There's sometimes where I wish I didn't, because exactly, you know exactly what I'm going to say, because it's you have the structure. Then when you break the structure, you then feel bad, or you start beating yourself up. And one of the big things I did, and I'm better now, and this is some of Beverly's help as well, has helped me to overcome this, is to stop beating myself up when I don't do things right, or in my mind,
in your mind.
you know, because it's only my mind, you know, or I don't achieve what I want to achieve, or I mess up something, or I make a problem, or I react badly. I beat myself up for so long. But on the flip side, it gives me the balance of be able to look in the mirror and go, no, sort yourself out. If you're acting an idiot, or you're doing this, or you're not, is to try and fix that. So
I think the ability on reflecting on your own emotions and your demons, your fears, and I think that's a very important skill that you've been able to hone over time.
James does it all the time and does it brilliantly, because James will face himself in the mirror and say, I need to work on this, I need to do less of this, more of that, and will have that conversation with himself and then put it into action. With me, sometimes it feels like you have to pull. I'm pulling it out of myself. I'm so used to being on my own and just writing the words down in a song or singing it. And I'm in a relationship. I am one half of this relationship, and I don't always verbalize what the processes that are going on here.
And that's from my dad.
And that is from my dad.
And that's, you know, and I've got things.
James will always do that. James will always speak these things, will always illuminate what is in his mind, and me, not so much.
It gets me to a calm point straight away. If I just say, and when I was young, I used to bottle it up and then just explode like a maniac, and it'd be in any situation.
You learned that's not the way to go for you.
I can't, you know, and now I just have to get it out straight away and say, right, that made me feel bad, or this, you know, or I'm worried about this at the moment. I even do it now. Probably yesterday, I didn't feel like I'm achieving where I want to be, you know, and I'm still doing it. But then I talk about it, and I don't want anyone to fix it, or I just go, right, it's out. I then go, okay, now I can deal with it. Now it's out there to the world that I haven't felt this in a certain way, or I'm not exactly where I want to be. And I don't mind saying that, you know, I'm not exactly where I want to be in my mind in life. You know, I've got an amazing life and I'm happy, but, you know, we talked about success or whatever, and I don't know where that is, and it's exciting and scary still, and I'm 43, but I still feel like I'm 22.
Yeah,
So,
me
but I
too.
would never go back to that. If
Yeah.
you could pay me all the money in the world, and I would
I'm
never
happier
go
now.
back to that.
Oh, yeah.
Some people say
Happier
I
now.
would pay all the money in the world to go
Dude,
back to
Yeah,
that.
no
But
way.
you could honestly, I'd swear on my life, you know, you could offer me £1 billion and I wouldn't go back to that and live through the last, I just wouldn't do it. I would only want to go back 12 years and live through that. Because that's my
That was
message.
our
right?
12 years.
I think there's a very valuable message, I think, is that with self-reflection and really getting to know you and what you need to you know, based on past experience to tackle all the emotions and you know, adverse situations that life sometimes throws at us and you know, most likely still will. So to build that resilience based on that reflection is can be a very powerful way of navigating life.
I think though as
it's
well.
important to look at yourself.
You do.
You do. You have to, because you have to learn the patterns.
But we
because
lie
then
to
you can
ourselves
see the,
as well,
the
though. That's
danger zones.
Isn't it? We do like our brains will try and do what isn't the right way to do it as well. So we will try and go.
Convince ourselves.
Yeah, we'll try and go for the easy option. You know.
So you have to be honest with yourself.
You have
You
to
have
be
to be honest.
brutally honest, but you also have to. You have to go through hormosis as well. So you have to go through a level of uncomfortableness or stressor to then grow from it, to become better. And that's why I think all of this, what happened in our lives, it can only make you stronger. And I say to my nephews now, because they've been through some tough times, and you know, and I say to them, you don't see it now, but you will be a stronger man for it, or you know, you will be stronger for it. You just have to believe that, and you have to self-reflect, like you said, and grow from it. And I think if you can do that, you're on a winner, whatever you do, whether you're a binman or a Jeff Bezos. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter. I think if you can find happiness in yourself and what you're doing, it's the Holy Grail.
That was a tough thing. That was hard for my dad, you know. In the end, my dad died in 2010. He was beginning to find his way back. He had a breakdown when just as I was going off to uni. And then all those years of resentment and difficulties with white people, particularly white people, because of, you know, like my choice of James and my sister choosing Christopher, and you know, that was difficult. But just towards the end of his life, he started to analyse himself, and it was a crisis that did that for him. My sister got very ill, was rushed to hospital. It frightened the life out of him.
And sometimes that's the
sometimes
catalyst.
that's what it
Again,
takes.
we talk about the catalyst, but
That's what it took.
But with health and wellness and all that things, you can't wait for that.
You mustn't.
So
I wish
all of
my
this,
dad
the mental
hadn't
health,
waited.
yeah, the mental health, the wellness, is so inextricably linked.
It is inextricably
you know,
linked.
and that's, I think, the takeaway that I would say to anyone is to go to try as much as they can holistically, you know, cold water therapy, good diet, you know, not beating yourself up, but being hard enough on yourself.
Or truthful enough.
Yeah, yeah.
Because that's not always being
yeah.
hard on yourself, but being
Yeah.
truthful with yourself. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's always the best way.
So
and I
it's
just think,
being prepared, building that resilience, prevent things, be it you know, physical ailments, be it emotional crisis, in such a way, by preparing for it. And you can only prepare by constantly reflecting and you know, taking away the positivity from your experiences. This has been a very, very powerful and insightful conversation.
Thank you for the.
Thank you so much for sharing also some of your very personal stories. I really, really appreciate
yeah,
you being with us.
we love the opportunity to be here.
Yeah, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Beverly.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.